The moment Lady Genevieve Sinclair realized what was about to happen, her heart seemed to stop. The grand ballroom of Hawkhurst Manor glowed with candlelight and crystal, filled with the low hum of polished voices and soft music drifting through the air. Silk gowns brushed marble floors. Gold and silver laughed together beneath towering chandeliers. It was the kind of night London society adored, and Genevieve quietly endured. She stood near a marble pillar, one gloved hand resting lightly against its cool surface, dark eyes moving calmly across the room. She had been born into this world of titles and traditions, yet she never felt fully at ease within it. At 22, she was already whispered about. Too sharp, too observant. Too unwilling to smile and agree, her blonde hair caught the candlelight like spun gold, her posture straight but relaxed, her expression thoughtful. Her late mother used to say Genevieve had been cursed with both beauty and intelligence, a combination that unsettled men who preferred one without the other. "You're doing it again," her younger sister Charlotte whispered as she appeared beside her, holding 2 glasses of champagne. "That look you make when you're studying people like they're puzzles." Genevieve accepted a glass with a faint smile. "I can't help it. Most people are predictable. Look there." Lord Peyton will raise a toast in a few minutes. Lady Catherine will pretend interest while counting jewelry. And someone will ask our host about India. Charlotte laughed softly. "Speaking of our host, have you seen the Duke yet?" Genevieve's fingers tightened slightly around her glass. "The terrifying Duke? They say he once made a man cry during a business meeting just by looking at him. That's absurd. Then explain why half the ladies are afraid to look at him and the other half want to throw themselves at him." Genevieve had heard the stories. Everyone had. Duke Lucian Hawkhurst. 32. Cold, wealthy, dangerous in reputation if not in action. He had inherited everything young, and ruled his world with sharp focus and little mercy. He avoided society for years, and when he returned, London watched him like a storm on the horizon. "There," Charlotte breathed. Genevieve followed her gaze. He stood near the fireplace, tall and commanding, dressed in black evening wear cut so perfectly it seemed designed for him alone. His dark hair was swept back, his face all sharp lines and calm authority. His eyes were pale blue, almost silver, and when they moved across the room, people shifted without realizing why. He was not gentle handsome. He was something more dangerous. "Goodness," Charlotte whispered. "The rumors were kind." "He's just a man," Genevieve said quietly. "A man who looks like he could break hearts without effort." Before Genevieve could reply, the major domo announced dinner. Guests flowed toward the dining hall in strict order of rank. The long mahogany table gleamed beneath candlelight. Genevieve was seated halfway down, Charlotte beside her, an elderly countess on her other side who immediately complained about drafts. At the head of the table sat the Duke. Near him were Lord and Lady Ashford. Edmund Ashford smiled too smoothly. His wife Margaret was beautiful in a practiced way, her laughter always a moment too perfect. Genevieve felt uneasy around them, though. She could not say why. Courses arrived one after another. Soup, fish, meat, wine flowed freely. Conversation drifted over her like noise she barely heard. Charlotte nudged her, whispering about a young man staring too long. Genevieve barely smiled. Then everything changed. Lady Margaret Ashford rose from her seat, appearing to greet someone farther down the table. As she passed behind the Duke, Genevieve noticed a movement. Small, precise, too deliberate. Margaret's hand slipped from the folds of her gown, holding a tiny glass vial. No larger than a thumb. She tilted it just enough. A clear liquid fell into the Duke's wine. Genevieve's heart slammed so hard it hurt. Time stretched thin. Sound faded. The room continued as if nothing had happened. Margaret moved on, smiling. Lord Ashford spoke loudly, gesturing, drawing attention away. The Duke reached for his glass. Genevieve did not think. She stood so fast her chair scraped loudly across the floor. Heads turned. She crossed the space between them in seconds. "Don't drink that," she whispered. Her hand struck the glass. Red wine spilled across the white tablecloth like blood. Silence fell. The Duke's eyes locked onto hers. Up close, they were colder and deeper than she imagined. Calculating, unyielding. "That was my wine," he said calmly. "It was poisoned," Genevieve said. Gasps filled the room. Lady Margaret stood abruptly. "This is absurd." Lord Ashford's face darkened. "My wife and I are being insulted by a hysterical girl." "I am neither hysterical nor mistaken," Genevieve said, though her hands trembled. "I saw Lady Ashford pour something into the Duke's wine." Voices rose. Accusations. Doubt. Someone suggested calling her father. Someone else whispered about scandal. Genevieve felt the room close in. Fear crept into her chest. What if she was wrong? Then the Duke took her hand. Warm. "Steady?" He stood, towering over the table. He did not let go. "I believe you," he said. The room erupted. Lady Margaret went pale. "I believe you," the Duke repeated. "And I suggest no one leaves until this matter is investigated." Margaret's hand moved toward her gown. "Don't," the Duke said softly. The word stopped her cold. Doctors were summoned. Servants were ordered. The Ashfords were escorted away under watchful eyes. Later, in the Duke's study, the truth was confirmed. "Arsenic in the wine. You saved my life," the Duke said quietly. "I did what was right," Genevieve replied. "You understand this will cost you," he said. "Society will turn against you." "I know." He studied her with something like respect. "Then we are allies now." Genevieve did not yet understand how deeply those words would change her life, but she felt it. The path behind her had closed, and something dangerous and extraordinary lay ahead. The morning after the dinner at Hawkhurst Manor arrived without mercy. London did not wait for truth. It never had. Genevieve woke to the sound of hurried footsteps in the corridor and Charlotte bursting through her door, her cheeks flushed and her eyes wide. "It's everywhere," Charlotte said breathlessly. "Every drawing room, every breakfast table." Genevieve sat up slowly. What is everywhere? The story, or rather, their story. Charlotte dropped a stack of letters onto the bed, invitations withdrawn. Visits postponed, polite words hiding sharp rejection. Genevieve read the first, then the second. Each one felt like a door closing. "What does Father say?" she asked quietly. "He's been in his study since dawn," Charlotte said. "Men have been coming and going. They're angry, Genevieve." "Not at the Ashfords. At you." Genevieve nodded. She had expected this. Still, the weight of it pressed hard against her chest. In her father's study, the air was tense. The Marquis Sinclair stood by the window, his back rigid. "Do you understand what you've done?" he asked without turning. "I saved a man's life. You accused powerful people of attempted murder in front of half of London. The wine was poisoned. That proves nothing about who did it," he said sharply. "The Ashfords claim the poison was added after the spill. They are telling everyone you imagined the rest." Genevieve felt anger rise. "They are lying. They are influential," her father said, finally turning to her. "And you are young, outspoken, and unmarried. You see the problem." He sighed heavily. "They want this to end. They've offered peace if you apologize publicly and admit you were mistaken." Genevieve stared at him. "You want me to lie? I want to protect my family. And what about justice?" He looked away. Before she could say more, the butler entered quietly. "My lord, the Duke of Hawkhurst is here." Genevieve's heart skipped. Lucian stood in the drawing room, dark coat perfectly cut, expression unreadable. When he saw her, his eyes softened just slightly. "You've heard," she said. "Yes." And you still came? I told you I believed you. I do not withdraw my word because society becomes uncomfortable. He explained calmly that he had hired investigators. Quiet men. Thorough men. He also explained the danger. They will try to ruin you, he said. They already are, I know. So I intend to make that difficult. He looked directly at her. I will court you. She blinked. You will what? Publicly. Clearly, without apology. That will make it worse. It will make them cautious, he said. They are counting on isolating you. This prevents that. Genevieve studied his face. And what do you gain? I protect an ally, and I send a message. She hesitated. This would be pretend, for now. She nodded slowly. Then there are rules. I will not be hidden or silenced. I will help investigate. A hint of a smile touched his mouth. Agreed. Within days, London noticed. The Duke appeared at the Sinclair home every afternoon. They rode through Hyde Park together. They attended events side by side. He danced only with her. Whispers followed them everywhere. Some called her clever. Some called her dangerous. Some called her a temptress. Lucian ignored them all. When Lady Peyton made a pointed remark about Genevieve's character, Lucian responded with cool precision that left the woman speechless and trembling. You do not insult someone under my protection, he said mildly. The Ashfords watched from a distance. Margaret smiled too tightly. Edmund avoided Lucian's gaze. Behind closed doors, the investigation deepened. Receipts appeared, gambling debts, apothecary records, names misspelled just enough to pretend innocence. One afternoon, Lucian sat at his desk, fists clenched. My father, he said quietly. He fell ill suddenly 2 years ago. The symptoms match. Genevieve felt cold. You think they did this before? I think they planned it longer than we realized. Then the maid arrived. Mary Fletcher stood trembling in the study, clutching a small vial, the same kind Genevieve had seen. I found it in her jewelry box, Mary said. Lady Margaret dismissed me when I asked. Lucian tested the contents. Arsenic. This changes everything, Genevieve whispered. Lucian nodded. Now we set a trap. Invitations went out for a dinner at Hawkhurst Manor. Carefully chosen guests. A magistrate. Influential men. And the Ashfords. They won't come, Genevieve said. They will, Lucian replied. Because I will announce our engagement. Her breath caught. Lucian, I need you to trust me, he said gently. Whatever happens after, you decide. That night, beneath candlelight, before stunned guests, Lucian declared his intention to marry Lady Genevieve Sinclair. Margaret's face drained of color. Then Lucian presented the evidence. The vial, the debts, the receipts, the testimony. Margaret broke. We only meant to make him weak, she sobbed. We needed control. The room went silent. The magistrate rose. The Ashfords were arrested. When they were gone, guests raised glasses to Genevieve. Apologies followed. Praise. Later, alone by the fire, Genevieve felt the weight finally lift. It's over, she said. Yes? And now, she asked softly. That depends, he said, on whether you believe this was only pretend. She did not answer yet. But her heart already knew, and so did his. The truth was out. The danger remained, and love, unexpected and undeniable, waited just beyond the edge of fear. The silence after the Ashfords were taken away felt heavier than the scandal itself. Genevieve stood near the window, watching the last carriage disappear into the dark. For the first time since that terrible night, she felt the world steady beneath her feet. The whispers would change now. Truth always reshaped them. Lucian remained by the fire, his hands clasped behind his back, his posture controlled, but his eyes restless. It's finished, Genevieve said softly. Yes, he replied, though the damage will take time to mend. She turned to face him. You announced our engagement." "I did," he said without hesitation. "If you wish, I will tell everyone it was strategy only. And if I don't wish that." He looked at her then, really looked at her, the mask finally gone. "Then I will ask you properly." The space between them felt charged, fragile. "I never expected this," Genevieve said. "I expected ruin, isolation. Not this." "Neither did I," Lucien said. "I have lived most of my life expecting betrayal." "You ran toward danger for a stranger." She swallowed. "I would do it again." "I know," he said. "That is why I fell in love with you." The words landed quietly, but changed everything. Genevieve closed her eyes for a moment, then opened them. So did I. The days that followed reshaped London society. Apologies arrived in careful letters. Invitations returned. Doors reopened, some out of fear, some out of admiration. Lucien did not soften. He stood beside Genevieve at every event, spoke her name with pride, defended her intelligence openly. When the trial began, the Ashfords confessed fully. Evidence of slow poisoning, forged documents. Financial desperation. Transportation was the sentence. The scandal ended as quickly as it had begun. The engagement became real. Lucien asked her father properly, with respect and sincerity. The Marquis gave his blessing with quiet relief. "You saw her?" he said simply. "You believed her?" Lucien nodded. That was enough. They married in a church filled with light and quiet emotion. No spectacle. No excess. Genevieve wore ivory silk. Lucien could not stop watching her. When they spoke their vows, there was no doubt. Only certainty. Marriage did not tame them. It strengthened them. Lucien supported her writing, her ideas, her refusal to stay silent. Genevieve challenged his guarded nature, his habit of carrying everything alone. They argued. They laughed. They built something honest. When their son was born, Lucien cried openly. "You saved me," he whispered. "We saved each other," she replied. Years passed. Hawkhurst Manor became known not for fear but for thought. Conversation. Change. Genevieve published. Lucien backed reform quietly but firmly. Their children grew strong and curious, and sometimes, late at night, Genevieve would think of that moment. The glass, the spill, the hand in hers. 3 words. I believe you. It had not only saved a life, it had built one. Together, they lived fully, fiercely, without regret, and long after scandal faded into memory, their story remained. Not of poison or betrayal, but of trust. And love strong enough to stand when the world demanded silence.